Good afternoon and welcome to the New America Foundation. I'm David Gray, and on behalf of our Workforce and Family Program, it is a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our event, The Challenges Facing American Families and How to Help Them. On this hot summer's day, I appreciate you all being here today on this important topic. American families have undergone profound changes in the past generation, as you know, in their composition, workforce attachment, child-rearing habits, and economic security. All sides of the political spectrum speak about the importance of family values. However, people in red states and blue states have some different conceptions about what is best for families. How do politics impact families? What are the differences between families in different parts of the country and between families today versus past generations? What changes are likely to occur in the future? What is the role of workplace flexibility for family-friendly workplaces? And what policies in general at the federal or state or local level can help families the most? These are some of the questions that we are gathered here to address this afternoon. And fortunately, we have a terrific group of speakers assembled to discuss the state and future of the American family. Complete biographies are available outside. I won't go through all the details of the accomplishments of our speakers, but let me introduce briefly Naomi Kahn, the professor at George Washington University School of Law and the co-author of Red Families, Blue Families, Legal Polarization, and the Creation of Culture, a book which is on sale today as you leave. June Carbone, professor at the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law, and again the co-author with Naomi of Red Families and Blue Families. Patrick Fagan, who's a senior fellow and director at the Center for Research on Marriage and Religion at the Family Research Council. My colleague A.L. Press, who's a Schwartz Fellow here at the New America Foundation and author of Absolute Convictions. Naomi, June, Patrick, A.L., we are so glad that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us today and share your wisdom. Thank you for being here. And thank you all for being here as well. We're going to have our speakers speak, and then when they're finished, we're going to open up to your thoughts and questions in our Q&A session. And thank you as well to all those who are joining us watching this live over the internet and on C-SPAN. So first, to begin our discussion today, let me introduce Naomi Kahn. Naomi?
Thank you very much. I'm going to echo some of your thanks. Thank you, David, for helping us all come together like this. Thanks to everybody for braving the Washington heat. Thinking of where we were just a little bit less than 6 months ago, braving the Washington cold. Thanks to friends and family who are here. And thanks to Ray Boshara, who is not here, but who was instrumental in making this happen from the New America Foundation and has been with us in this book for many years. He organized an event here a couple of years ago that was incredibly helpful. We also, as long as I'm up here thanking people, I feel like I'm giving, an Academy Award speech, but we want to thank the families of America and the American electorate as well for giving us something to write about. And I think at the end we'll thank our co-panelists again, but thank you also, everybody, for being here. Now, I want to just, June's going to start with the PowerPoint, but I just want to give you a little bit of background on what got us started writing this book. We actually didn't start writing until after the 2004 election, which is why I did in fact thank the American electorate. But our interest in family systems started almost a decade ago when we first started collaborating on various writing projects. We became very interested in evolutionary psychology. And we quickly found that even a cursory look at the anthropological literature belied conservative claims that the family was somehow fixed and unchanging. Indeed, serial monogamy seemed to be more common than long-term fidelity, at least as we viewed the anthropological literature. At the same time, some patterns seemed persistent enough to make us skeptical of the claims that family life was infinitely flexible. So there we were, somewhere between the family is fixed and unchanging, and the family is infinitely flexible. Children, for example, seem to benefit from the commitment of more than one adult in just about every society. Now, just as we were mulling over the potential implications for modern family law of what we were learning from the anthropological literature, the 2004 election happened. And I know I'm talking ancient history here, but that's how we got started on this. And the polls at that point highlighted the role of moral values in President Bush's reelection. We read with recognition the op-eds highlighting the high teen birth rates and the high divorce rates in the parts of the country ranking moral values at the top of voters' lists of concerns. We thought we knew the answer, and it's an exploration of that answer that June is going to continue with.
Thank you. Let me also emphasize how delighted I am to be here, and it is with a little bit of trepidation that I begin. We attribute to the New America Foundation a great deal of gratitude for helping us frame the issue not in terms of statistics, but in terms of Bristol Palin. And secondly, that I have family members here, and therefore I will note I will not tell some of the stories I have told before that are too personal. But I do want to note my husband is an expert on the financial crisis, and he reminds me, as you will see at the slides at the end, not to forget the economy. So with that note, our story begins in the 50s. And to understand, I think, what has happened to the American family, you have to understand that the real sex revolution is the one in the 50s. The 60s is a response to what happened in the 50s. And as Stephanie Coons reminds us, what happened is we reversed all the patterns of the previous century. So women having sex before the age of 21, the number in the 50s jumps from 40% to 70%. Brides pregnant at the altar, giving birth within 8.5 months of the wedding, it jumps to 30%, the highest number since 1800, when bundling was still the norm. Average age of marriage drops to 20 for women, 22 for men, the youngest in a century, and in part because too many girls in their teens are getting pregnant. And if you look at college women in universities in 1963, 80% want 3 or more children. That number by 1973, 10 years later, only 29% instead of 80% will want 3 or more children. So the 50s and an era of sexual brinkmanship set the stage for what we think of as the sexual revolution that comes next. I'm going to go through quickly some slides that capture how what for the baby boomers was an incredible transformation in a 10-year period. So we start with teen births. And you can see from this slide that teen births jump in the 50s. They reach an all-time high in the US, and then they decline sharply. And the big drop starts around 1963 and then tails off once you get into the 80s. And it's that change that really captures the period that puts in place what we're going to describe as the emergence of a blue family norm. And you see with the second line, the red line, the other change that begins a bit later but really takes off is that teen births today are overwhelmingly outside of marriage. We'll talk more about that later. The next thing is what starts and really propels the change is the change for the generation going off to college. And the number of men and women in college doubles during this period. It more than doubles for women. So take a look at the changes in attitude. For women who were born in 1950, which means you're talking about a group that's getting married around 1970, half are married by the age of 23. Go 7 years later to those born in 1957. Less than 30% are married by 23. So the shift starts with a change in the age of marriage. And it is connected to changing opportunities for women. So in 1970, women constitute less than 1% of professional students across the board. But by 1980, women jumped to 30% of those in medical school, 36% in law, 19% in dentistry, 28% in business. Another very dramatic change taking place in the same time period, the number of adoptions, babies placed for adoption, peaks at an all-time high in 1970 and falls in half by 1975. What's going on? Well, this is the period described as the sexual revolution. Golden and Katz, who are a couple of economists at Harvard, do a wonderful study trying to tease this out, and they say 25% of the change in marriage rates are due to the legalization of the pill for college-age women. Part of what happens in the early part of the period is the age of majority drops from 21 to 18, and all of a sudden you can get contraception on college campuses throughout the country. You have Supreme Court decisions that don't come in until 1977, guaranteeing that as a right for teens. You have Roe versus Wade in 1973, and Golden and Katz say both contraception and abortion has an effect, but the much bigger effect is contraception. So we argue that's what sets the stage for what we're calling the new blue world, or our blue family paradigm. And to summarize it as a set of values, it's invest in women as well as men's earning capacity. The sine qua non for adulthood and for responsible family formation becomes emotional maturity and financial independence. Families are something you start after you're an adult. They are no longer the gateway to adulthood. Deregulate sexuality, who's sleeping with whom is not so important, but manage childbearing. It's childbearing that's important in the new era. And a combination of public tolerance toward sex, toward different kinds of relationships, but responsibility instilled in the private arena. So, red backlash. And let's see. We have now this blue world. Now, we could simply describe red, and we usually describe red as traditional family values. Family values that in 1950, 1960, 1840, 1840 is a different story, I won't go there. But I have some jokes about it, won't go there. We used to share. When we talk about red, we're really talking about traditional norms. I'm not going to present them that way right now because I want to describe this as a chronological story. And so if I were to go back to 1840, and you see the revolution that takes place in family values, when all those brides pregnant at the altar, those numbers drop in the 19th century from 30% in 1800, 10% by 1860. We're going in the other direction here. But rather than a gradual change led by the college-educated middle class, gradually taking hold in the rest of the country, we instead see a backlash. And that backlash is fueled by a series of things. The most basic is it's at odds with religious teachings about sexuality. It condones, not always explicitly, but certainly implicitly, that abstinence until marriage after graduate school is no longer realistic and isn't the objective. It conflicts with traditional attitudes toward gender. The revolution starts with women going off to college in places where they're unsupervised. As we marry later, women are much more independent and have opportunities that mean they will be contributing to family income. The more important differences, I think, to understand what comes next are class-based and region-based, and I'm going to talk about them in detail in a few minutes. There are also cultural differences about attitudes toward autonomy and the construction of values. But most critically, I think, there is anxiety about family stability. And that's what I want to talk about next. Where are we now that the revolution is mostly over? Well, I want to start by saying, here's how we summarize red and blue. I said we talk too much these days about Bristol and Levi. But there is, and we've picked the Obamas as our model of blue, but there's one thing I want you to get from this slide, and that is we think if we were to show Bristol and Levi a picture of the Obamas on their wedding day, that their reaction would be, those people are really old. And that's what I want to do next. What happens now that we're at the other end of this revolution of the 60s and 70s? Let's take a look at divorce. And these slides largely come from Sarah McLanahan's work, sociologist at Princeton. If you look at these slides, this is the divorce rate in the 90s. What you see is the bottom line, people who have completed college. The divorce rate drops steadily, and by the mid-90s, it's back to what it was in 1965, before the pill, before all of these things happened. If you look at the rest of the country, divorce rates are still going up. So the talks that as family law professors we go to is how, divorce rates have plateaued. They're not plateauing. They're splitting. Two different reactions. This is trends in single motherhood. And again, this goes through the year 2000. What you see, that bottom line, college graduates, it was never very high, and it declines by the end of the 90s back to what it was in 1965. When you look at the top group, which are poor women, women who don't graduate from high school, you see that single motherhood is actually dropping, but at a very, very high level. But the middle, it's going up. And so if you think of white women between the ages of 20 to 24, who define probably a large part of the country, single parenthood is rising through the end of the 90s. This is trends in family income. Remember my husband, the financial expert. This is deeply connected to the economy. The top group, college graduates, are doing very well on family income. The rest of the country is stagnating or doing worse. And finally, this is the story on the median age of marriage. Remember when I said Levi and Bristol might think the Obamas are very old? The big change in age of marriage is college graduates. That's the top line. Yes, it's mother's median age, but mothers who are college graduates who have children under the age of 5. You can see that the line goes up through the year 2000 and it continues going up thereafter. For the bottom group, it stays about the same, increases slightly for those in the middle. Later ages of marriage and childbearing are the norm. Now, wrong too quickly. If you map these on to geography, what you find is this is age of first marriage by state, and it looks a lot like red-blue politics. New York, New England declining sharply, California declining sharply, upper Midwest. When I say declining, I mean the average age is going up for the blue states, and that's the upper Midwest. New England most dramatically, mid-Atlantic states, California, not happening in the middle of the country. And this is something called the second demographic transition by county. And it says, where are we in terms of this transformation? It's a composite number that looks at things like non-marital cohabitation rates, that's blue, age of marriage, the higher it is, the bluer, abortion rates. Divorce rates are higher in red states. And it is a composite of things, which side of the demographic transition are you on, mapped out by county. We then get to the core of the book. And here I'm simply going to say what we've got is something where our conclusion, blue, defined as an embrace of this new model, and best represented by college graduates, are doing fine. Two-parent families, marriages that are less likely to end in divorce, very low rates of non-marital births, high levels of family stability. Red, defined now in terms of a traditional emphasis, abstinence until marriage, relatively early marriage, marriage at younger ages, and no emphasis and less emphasis on contraception and preventing the early births. What you're seeing is much higher levels of family instability. But when we talk about these things, we talk past each other. And we're suggesting part of the reason we do is a cultural conflict. Blue values emphasize equality, respect for diversity, public tolerance, private responsibility. With red, and especially in a time of perceived crisis about family values, moral values, universal rules, externally derived public order, and sin and redemption in the private area, in the private arena. one more, again, just summarizing that point, we define red as emphasizing external moral affirmation that guides sexuality into marriage and makes marriage work, and blue as a set of internalized norms that guide the exercise of choice and link family formation to financial independence and emotional maturity. We talk past each other. And on that note, Naomi is going to talk about our centrist ideas.
June will be back up. Okay, so there are claims that the red system has one set of values and the blue system has no values whatsoever. It believes in freedom, licentiousness. I'll leave you to fill in what the rest of that sentence would be. And so I'm just lingering on this slide for one more second just to say that there are, in fact, different values that define each of what we're identifying as the red and the blue family systems. I should also say, and June, the slides that June was going through make it clear, we at one point had thought of calling the book Red State versus Blue State, but first of all, that name was already taken. But second of all, what we're talking about are systems that are classified by a group of values as opposed to by state. So you have blue families in red states, red families in blue states, purple families in all states, etc. So what we're talking about are a cluster of beliefs that we identify with each of the different sets of family values. Now, obviously, there's quite a bit of conflict. You only have to look at the Supreme Court's term this past year to figure that out, to look at public opinion polls, to look at the Stupak Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. There is conflict on these cultural values when it comes to families. So, as June said, we nonetheless, and we get flack from both the right and the left on this, we have some suggestions on how we might be able to talk to each other in a more constructive fashion and to get to some of the issues that concern people who adhere to both the red and the blue family systems. And so in the book, and subsequently, what we've talked about, how the politics of division exacerbate cultural conflict. And instead, what we think should happen is that there should be movement to change the subject to issues that we can all agree on. Abortion, hugely divisive. Contraception, depending on which studies you read, 90 to 99% of American women will use some form of contraception during their lifetime. If it's controversial, there's that 1 to 10% for whom contraception is controversial. But for most women and for most of their male partners, one assumes contraception should not be that controversial. Change the topic from sex ed to marriage ed, and then finally, in terms of thinking about family, change to talk from family to employment. That is, how do we make employment, how do we make the workplace more family friendly for people who are in both red and blue family systems? So we think we should be talking about family formation and the best way in which to encourage family formation, that is to deter early childbearing, to deter teen childbearing, that is teen births, and to deter unplanned pregnancies. If you look at who it is that actually is experiencing unplanned pregnancies, you'll see that people most likely to experience unplanned pregnancies are poor women. People most likely to have abortions are poor women. People most likely to have unplanned births are poor women. And so all the way down, that purple line, the long purple line, is women between the ages of 15 to 44 who earn less than the poverty level, The bottom very faint line is women who are at 200% plus of the poverty level. And then if you go back to some of the slides that June was showing, you'll see we can put them together to see that most of the women at 200+% of the poverty rate are going to be women who have college education, whose income has been going up. So in terms of unwanted pregnancies, they've risen among women living below the poverty level. They fall for more affluent women. They rise for high school dropouts, and they've fallen for college graduates. The teen rate is kind of wavering right now. It had fallen for many years. It's gone up, and it's kind of stabilizing at a little bit higher than it's been, which is what the next slide would have shown. There we go. So in the next slide, teen pregnancy falls across the board during the 90s. Some of that is due to abstinence education. Abstinence education has been a bigger factor for the drop among 15 to 17-year-olds, among whites and people with higher income families, but most of the decline in teen pregnancy is due to better contraception. So therefore, our first point, change the subject to talk about contraception. If you want to affect the abortion rate, talk about contraception. Okay, we have a few slides on the inequality with respect to abstinence education that I'm going to just move on to the next one. You may remember Miss USA's comments when she was asked about contraception. I believe that birth control is just like every other medication, even though it's a controlled substance. Of course, not all birth control methods are controlled in quite the same way. Okay, in terms of, let's see, our second message, well, this is an interesting slide. It just shows you what's happened with respect to polarization on abortion by party, something that I.L. Press's Absolute Convictions book also discusses quite wonderfully, and that you may be talking about. But if you look in 1980, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats are very similar when it comes to their views on abortions. It's only as the issue becomes exploited for political gain by Republicans, in our view, that the support for abortion drops among Republicans and kind of increases, leveling off among Democrats. But not so long ago, we were at a relatively similar place, and in fact, there were some years in which Republicans were more likely to be pro-choice than were Democrats. Okay, that then brings us to our next message, change the subject to marriage education as opposed to sex education. If you look at what discourages divorce, greater commitment between the parties, greater maturity, financial realism and preparation. There's been this, the timing is nice because the New York Times and the Washington Post have both had wonderful articles recently on marriage education. So making many of these same points, mutual respect, shared interests, recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence in order to make sure that marriages that shouldn't be together, in fact, don't stay together. And so these are two of the places where we want to change the subject. We want to change the subject from abortion to contraception, from sex ed to marriage ed. And now June is going to return to issues that are of interest to all of us, as well as particularly, as she said, to her husband.
Yes, and I will, and quickly, but one little comment on this. When we said that the drop in teen pregnancies in the 90s is due to greater abstinence, 15% is due to greater abstinence. There is no evidence it's linked to abstinence education, which expands after the trend is already in place. And the concentration of that 15% tends to be primarily whites from families that are headed to college. If you want to know who's really abstinent at 15, it's those folks going to Harvard. They did a survey of entering Harvard freshmen that shows only 15% of Harvard freshmen say they are not virgins. And that's the group where abstinence takes off in the 90s. We have lots more about it, but I'm going on now to the economy. We recognize when we did this red and blue that there is no point in telling people who are not going to college, wait until after graduate school to have your kids. And so when we started looking, what is happening to what used to be traditional Americans, we call it communities on the cusp, marriage-centered communities where almost everybody marries, where if you're really going to fully participate in the community, you need to be married. What's happening there? And as the slides at the beginning, we're suggesting that the place where family values are really raw are families that are communities that are marriage-centered, where the non-marital birth rate is going up, but more critically, the divorce rate is very high and has stayed high. Why is that happening? The most fascinating study is one by Paul Amato, and I'm going to put together, quite quickly I hope, a set of slides that capture what we think is going on. First, the economy. This is what's happened to wages. If you're at the top, they're going up. This is the Great Recession. As David Brooks has reported recently, employment is down 1% for the top group. You're in the middle, stagnation. Employment is up 8% as a result of the Great Recession. You're at the bottom, times are tough, and unemployment. When I said employment, unemployment is up 16% for the bottom group, and wages are below, in real dollar terms, what they were in 1973. How does this react to family? A mismatch between men and women. Women are doing better. Women are more likely to graduate from college, more likely than men to graduate from high school. If you look at the occupations, what you find is that women now have higher status occupations than men, and it's most true for African Americans. What does that mean in real terms? It means take a high school graduate woman. She's likely to be doing something like working at Walmart's, where she at least has health care benefits. He's likely to be doing construction. If he's doing construction today, the odds are good he's laid off. What happens to family? This is divorce proneness as it's tied to economic distress. The first set of numbers are 1980. Small difference between families that perceive economic distress, families that don't. Jump to 2000, a prosperous time. Families in economic distress are much more divorce prone. Families that are not in economic distress are less divorce prone than in 1980. What's going on? This is employment stability. The top line is women, it's up. Bottom line is men, steady downturn. And those are cohorts. The 1980 is when people are born, not the year 1980 for employment. Final point, Paul Amato, Alone Together, pulls this all together and says, what is the impact of this changing economy on family stability? Well, women who expect to be in the labor force, who have careers, dual career couples, both agree on that, they're doing great. People who have traditional attitudes, you know, the husband ought to support the family, the wife ought to be taking care of the kids, but she's working full-time because he can't support her. That group is the least happy group in the country right now in terms of marital stability and happiness. And so we argue that the final piece on this, to putting together this picture, is if you follow a traditional route, you expect a traditional division of gender roles, you get married young. What Amato finds in the year 2000 is virtually everybody who gets married in the early 20s is experiencing financial distress. And the mismatch between the jobs available to men and the jobs available to women are increasing with the Great Recession. And if the couples enter into marriage in their early 20s with the wife expecting to stay home with the kids instead of completing college and working on her own, and the husband can't support her, that couple is extremely likely to divorce. So our final point on Bristol and Levi, we have to come back to them. When we look at their futures, the one thing that is virtually irrelevant is marriage. Why? Because for somebody who gets pregnant at 17 and marries the father, the critical issue is, does she stay in school and does she avoid having the second kid right away? If they got married, they had the second kid maybe to save the marriage, they're divorced by 22, and she and the child are worse off. If, on the other hand, she stays in school and avoids the birth of the second child right away, they're better off. Marriage is unimportant if they can't make a go of it. And to make a go of it, they have to have a shared set of expectations about what the future is going to be like. We hear they're back together, and we wish them well. If they get married in the mid-20s, sharing a common vision of the future, they may do quite well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, June and Naomi, for that great introduction to this great, important subject, and to your book, which I'm even more fascinated to complete now. I also appreciate Naomi mentioning Ray Bouchard, our colleague here, whose wisdom and generosity is critical in today's event. And now it's a pleasure to welcome Pat Fagan to the podium. Pat is welcoming back to the New America Foundation for his perspective and his wisdom. Pat?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and congratulations on the book. The presentation is quite informative. I come from the red side, but not in an ideological sense. By training, I'm a clinical psychologist, did a lot of child, marital, family work, and that's what got me into it. I came here to do my doctorate in a political city, and then began to look at what government was doing with family and thought it was pretty destructive, actually. That's what caused me to transition into public policy. That was my motivation. I'll get to that a bit later. I have become, I was at one stage a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Social Services Policy. On top of all the, that's at HHS. ASPE, which is the biggest repository of evaluation data on social programs, is over there. And I crossed a Rubicon there because I found that social policy is not working at the federal or state level. Social programs work, some of them very well, but at a very localized level because they're essentially person-dependent, capacity-dependent, leadership-dependent. So there's a real anomaly here, and it's not an easy nut to crack. I think we're in for a long period of learning. I think a lot of mistakes are going to continue to be made. So as I become less enamored of public policy, which is I've come to the conclusion late in life that I don't think government has the competence to do a lot in many of the social areas. It has real competences, and there are areas where government can be very effective and do a lot of good. The social is not one of them. I've come to that conclusion. The single biggest one, actually, that does come close to your area, and I want to get into actually the sexuality area. And if I forget, call me back to what I think is a big failure in this area on government's part. If you look at the data from the 1950s up to the present, I think I love what you're doing. I think there's a great conversation to be had because we are in crisis. There's no doubt about it. Our children intergenerationally, I think, are doing worse and are getting weaker. Has huge implications even for foreign policy. When men and women have the capacity to stay together, and this is what I think, and this is where we're in real agreement, when the mother and father can stay together, the children thrive, by and large. The data is repetitive on that. When they split, both the parents and the children weaken. At the aggregate level, the data is repetitive on that too. Now, in 1950, for every 100 kids born, that year about 12 kids entered a broken family, either from divorce or out of wedlock births. Fast forward to today, and it's over 60. For every 100 kids born, about 60 to 65, somewhere in there, enter a broken family. Now, what that means is that fathers and mothers, the adult men and women, over the last 50 years, have less and less capacity to come together and to stay together so that they can raise the children they brought into existence. A very controversial way to say that is we have become sexually more and more dysfunctional. Because the ultimate measure of sexual functionality is this capacity of men and women to come together, to beget, and to raise. And we're getting worse and worse all the time. We're on a wrong track. We haven't really figured out how to change that. I personally think, and here's where I really disagree, is a very unpopular, but the data is overwhelming and compelling. It's politically most incorrect because 90% more, 99% will disagree with me. Contraception has totally altered the sexual equation. Totally altered it. I think everybody is in agreement on that, like there's no doubt. And it did not bring about a decrease in abortions. Actually, you look at the time when it came, abortions flew out the... Now, we've had some leveling off of abortion. Not leveling off, well, decrease. It's continuing to decrease. There are changed attitudes on that. Contraception, when you look at what it really opens up, actually, is multiple sexual partners. It makes that easy. And that is part of what I think is part of the equation of the sexual dysfunction. To be explored. I can't just make a fiat and say that. I think the data points that way, but there's not much discussion on this. And I think this is at the heart. The capacity of men and women to come together, to stay together, and to raise their children. The data you did point out, I didn't know it, but that 15% on Harvard, only 15% have been sexually active. Essentially, our elites know this and shepherd their kids that way. Okay? And that's part of the reason why they stay elite. You begin to fool around, you get broken relationships, you get depressions, you get kids dropping out of school, you get kids getting messed up in undergraduate and graduate levels. They're very aware of the power of the sexual. And sex gone wrong, Freud had it, from eros to thanatos. Thanatos is the depression, the destruction, and all of the rest. And I think we're living that out. The other thing, we are in agreement, I do think, and I'm totally with you, it would be very good to build, again, a culture of stable marriage. How do we do that? One of the anomalies that's out there, when you look at, and I agree with you, we have done the National Child Health Survey is a very good one on both family structure and lots of things. You rank order the states. We have a study up on our website, and you can see it. The Northeast down to the South, you've got this, there's a great anomaly. Family structure goes this way by the states. If you look at the same states by religious attendance, you get this way. The highly religious attendant down to the least, you go from Mississippi, which has got the most broken family, is the highest in religious attendance, down to, up in the Northeast is where you got the low states. And yet, and here's the mystery. When you look at it family by family, when families worship, they tend to be more intact. They tend to be more stable. Their sexuality is different. I don't have an answer to that, but it does point to, we've got a lot of confusion here in this country on this, and we definitely don't have consensus of more line. By the way, I should stop speaking in how many minutes? I don't want to go. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. When you look at religious attendance, it's not well known out there, even in the academic literature. But the more frequent the religious attendance, the better the outcome on every single outcome you can track in the federal surveys. Again, we have that up on our website. You can track it. We're just doing the correlational stuff, but for the whole of America, for instance, grade point average, Those who worship weekly, a couple of times a month, a couple of times a year, never. Essentially, you get that same trend at different slants on the positive things, and on the negatives, it's lowest in those who worship weekly and going up. This is an area of strength. On this, in modernity, we're all in confusion. We got great disagreements. I'm going out to the Libertarian conference, Freedom Fest, religion on trial. This is among the libertarians. Where are they? Probably a bit more the Republican side, but they're very ambivalent about religion. So we've got a lot of big things where we have lost consensus, we have lost cultural unity on two of the big loves. The love of God, the love of neighbor, closest neighbor being your spouse and your family. And we are in massive disarray and disagreement on these things. So as a result, you get chaos. One of the things that is happening and that I think is driving, and I would suggest you begin to look into this, there is a huge transfer of payments taking place from the intact family to the non-intact. And that's something that I think politically is driving some of the concerns. And that is not going to add to our political unity either. We'll disagree. That's going to drive divisions. If these things are free choices, one of the things I would say, let people pay for their freedom. I'm looking forward to the discussion that's going to take place from your book. I hope I'll provoke you and the rest to begin to think. I don't think there are simple solutions here. I do totally agree with you to restore a culture of marriage. How we go about doing that, we've got to respect the differences. And divisions between right and left, red and blue, are not good for unity of the country. We've got to find bridges. We've got enough divisions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pat. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Eyal Press. Eyal?
Thank you also, David, and New America, and fellow panelists for all coming here, and guests. I, as has been mentioned, wrote a book called Absolute Convictions, which is about the abortion conflict in the city I grew up in, Buffalo, New York. And one reason I start with that is because we're talking about blue families and red families, and I think that in our minds, because we've all watched enough election coverage and looked at maps, we think of those families and transmute them onto states. When in reality, in the city I grew up in, which is in a blue state, you had a very volatile mixture of passionately red families and some passionately blue families, and as a result of that, a tremendous amount of conflict that unfortunately culminated in quite a bit of first social unrest and then violence with a murder in 1998 of an abortion provider named Barnett Slepian. My book kind of chronicles the various stages of the culture wars that played out in the city from the early 70s on through. I wish I had the benefit of your book before I started mine, because one point in particular that was made here, where you contrasted, Naomi and June contrasted those who, the red and the blue, and spoke about people who have internalized norms that influence choice. And if I had known that before I started my book, I would have used it to sort of sort the people that reacted very happily to the changes that took place in the 60s and 70s in Buffalo, and those who reacted very unhappily. And they're not necessarily who you think. So if you think about, again, internalized norms that influence choice, in Buffalo you have a lot of Rockefeller Republicans and upper middle class, working class, middle class, but fairly stable Catholic families. their children are growing up. Some of them are going to public school. Some of them are going to Canisius, Catholic high school. But many of them are then going on to college. They actually do fall into the group, I think. Didn't do a study of it, but I would think that had these internalized norms in various ways, maybe they got them from the church, but maybe they got them at home, maybe they got them from the neighborhood. Whatever it was, adjusted well to a world where there was more divorce, there was the pill, there were other forms of contraception, abortion was legal. They might not have liked that it was legal, but it was. But they could deal with all of those choices without feeling like the ground underneath them had just cracked and nothing was the same and life was chaos. The groups in Buffalo that did not react well to all those changes, and that by the mid and late 80s are passionately involved in opposing abortion and focusing on this as the great thing that caused this tragic decline in the city, are not the group I just talked about, even though Buffalo is often described as Catholic city, working class, blue collar, Rust Belt. Most of them were evangelicals. They, by and large, came from, in fact, the two most charismatic leaders grew up Jewish in Grand Island and had a very, very rough upbringing, very, very rough adolescence as they themselves saw it. They had all these choices in front of them, and they got into sex, they got into drugs, they got into all kinds of stuff that sort of made them feel out of control. And then one day they went to a Pentecostal church and became born again, and their life became very ordered and stable. And they became the leaders of the movement that became Operation Rescue in Buffalo and that got sort of passionately involved on that issue. So in that sense, I think we have a set of misnomers or a set of labels that maybe don't always apply very well in terms of understanding who reacts well, who doesn't react well, who is fearful of those choices that come up, who is not fearful of those choices. And my own impression from the reporting I did was that it had a lot to do with class, a lot to do with educational background, a lot to do with if you have the confidence in yourself to know that you can navigate this world where you suddenly aren't told you must marry when you're 22 or 23 or whatever it is, you will do well. And not to pick a fight, but I will offer my own impression on somewhat different than Pat's about contraception. I tried to write my book giving as much respect as possible to both sides, pro-life, pro-choice, even though I'm myself pro-choice unequivocally. What I had a hard time with was understanding how people who are passionately concerned about abortion and unplanned pregnancies are also passionately opposed to contraception and sex education. And I would just offer a guess that of the Harvard students, the 15% who, I guess the 85% who come in and have not yet had sex, I would guess if we ask them again at 25, more of them will have. If we ask them again at 30, the percentage would be very high. If we ask them at 35, it would probably be all of them. A lot of them will not have had children by then, is my guess. Very few of them will have had children who grew up without two parents, in troubled situations, in unplanned ways. And I would hasten to guess that they were using contraception along the way. So my own view is that if we're going to deal with the cultural issues, we need to think about class, we need to think about educational background, we need to think about how to expand, how to make people more comfortable with the choices that in this day and age are unavoidably there. And since I have to stop, I didn't get to the other piece of this, which is certain policies that I think both red families and blue families stand to benefit from. Maybe we can get to that later.
All right, well, that's a great teaser for our next session, which is to call our panelists forward, and we're going to ask them to sit here for our next part of this. One of the great things I love about New America is its ability to, on difficult topics, social, cultural issues, to convene a variety of voices, all of them very well thought through and researched. And I think you've seen that today. And to have an audience here with a lot of thoughts themselves. I'm going to take the bait here from Eyal and ask him to talk very briefly as the first question about, just as a prerogative here, on policies for solutions, if you want to just mention quickly, and then ask for thoughts on the family-friendly workplace piece that June and Naomi lift up in their book, just briefly, solutions from both generally from Eyal and then on the family-friendly piece. Okay.
What I'd hoped to talk about was an article I wrote in the New York Times Magazine called Family Leave Values. And it was about a crusader, family values crusader named Joan Williams, who's a law professor, and who has helped plaintiffs in a growing number of workplace discrimination cases. These are not cases about gender. They are not cases about race. They are cases in which workers file suit against their employers, claiming that they were discriminated against because they had family responsibilities. They were trying to raise a child. They got pregnant. They had responsibilities at home. And as a result, they were discriminated against. The fascinating thing about these cases is that even though there is no federal law protecting this category, over 50% of the cases, or of the plaintiffs, win their cases, which is higher than employment discrimination cases of other categories. How can that be? The reason it can be is because if you put such a case before a liberal or a conservative judge, they're liable to be very sympathetic. They're liable to say, well, look, here is a family that, because we don't live in the world anymore where one parent on one job can support a spouse and a couple of kids. Because of that, you have parents being pulled out of the home. How are they going to balance these responsibilities, which are inevitable for all but the real financial elite at this point? And so they're winning their cases. They are, in a sense, family values cases. Of course, there are other ways to address that problem other than lawsuits. A better way, in my opinion, would be the way Sweden addresses it. For example, giving I think it's 16 months of paid leave to parents, divided, by the way, if people want to, between the two, either the mother or the father. England is more skimpy. I think they give 50 weeks paid. We give unpaid in only some businesses. So anyway.
All right. So building off that, we'll ask for any thoughts on the family-friendly piece from June and from Naomi. And then, Pat, if you want to think about it, just any response generally to what's been shared, and then we'll open up quickly to our audience.
Okay. Joan Williams' work is quite wonderful in terms of talking about a maternal wall and a paternal wall. And although there's no federal law in this, as you said, since your article, which I remember reading and loving, was written, she has helped she has, I guess, discussed with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, some regulations relating to discrimination against caregiving parents. And so, although it's not yet law, she's helped move the regulations to say that discrimination against parents, either men or women, who provide caregiving to their children constitutes discrimination. Now, the family, as you mentioned, Family and Medical Leave Act is unpaid, and it only applies to employers with a certain number of employees. There's movement to try to expand the FMLA to cover more employers who have smaller workforces, as well as to expand the FMLA so that it covers employees who have worked for the employer for less than the current requisite time period of a year. So there's certainly efforts to expand the FMLA to provide paid leave, to provide leave for parents who work for smaller employers, and to provide leave to provide paid leave within the first year of employment. So that's certainly one way of making the workforce and the workplace more friendly to families, is to increase the job protections for both men and women once they have children. Other ways of doing that are by improving child care, by improving the quality of child care that's available, by improving, now these are quite often going to be blue family solutions when we're talking about this, but also for red families. Bristol Palin, just to come back to our wonderful poster child here, has talked about how she would actually like to pursue a college education, but I think she's too busy working to be able to do that. And so one thing to do, some of you may have seen her on The Secret Life of American Teenagers the other night. My kids certainly did. And so one way of improving the workplace for red families is to provide more support for being able to continue an education while you are pursuing employment, to provide more financial support for women in those situations. Do you want to add?
I'm only going to say almost all of this is blue. It doesn't address the problem of red, because the more valuable the worker, the longer hours the worker is putting in, the more men as well as women's employment interferes with family, and the more the employer can afford to cut some slack. The farther down the socioeconomic ladder you go, the more work-family balance is irrelevant. The problem is the mismatch between men and women and their expectations.
Let me say that the best way to improve work-family flexibility is to help both men and women maximize their educational opportunities. Now, it doesn't mean everybody has to go to college, because obviously not everybody wants to go to college, not everybody should go to college. College is not a panacea, but it does mean maximizing capabilities of going on to technical schools, of being able to improve training, and of not having a child had too early derail those opportunities.
As some of you know, we had events here in this room. I did one on June 15th on paid leave specifically, and May 13th on flexibility. Many of you were here for those that build on some of these. You can watch them on the website. And I actually have a 2 o'clock call with a friend in Sweden who has 2 little kids, so I'm going to ask him about some of your thoughts. Pat.
Actually, picking up on Sweden and picking a fight, we'd have great fun. On the whole, from the proxy data I've been able to do and do international comparisons, I was talking about America splitting men and women, less capacity to belong. If you take a belonging or a rejection index, Sweden is even worse than we are, and their policies are not working for the intactness of family, and as a result for the happiness of children. So I don't look to Sweden because of that, and to me actually that's one of the key long-range outcomes. One of the dangers I see on the whole thing of workplace arrangements, the separation of the child, particularly from the mother, because men are not equipped here, and men can help, great for husbands, you want them, but the early infant attachment, the data is becoming more and more clear the more we look at it. You've got an intergenerational danger here. The more the child is separated from the mother, the more likely the attachment process will go dysfunctional or be weaker. And the capacity later to marry and keep it is weakened. So much as you would like to have women have all the advantages of work and family at the same time, there seems to be a major incompatibility with the capacity of the child to grow to adulthood. Where this is most clear and where federal policy is an absolute disaster is in family planning, which is use contraception and all the rest that you're advocating now for how long? 40 years? The main recipients have been our poor, and their marriage has disappeared. And going back to Andrew McCarthy, which you quoted, some of the other data he has, now our poor, on average, partners change every 18 months. He calls it churning. So the culture that federal policy has built for our poor families in matters of sexuality and family is an absolute disaster and a crime against the poor. This churning situation is everything to give you everything you don't want. Crime, abuse, breakup, addictions, and what you have there, actually, the girls tend to do better. The boys are doing worse and worse and worse because the men are not around. The girls have a modeling of a strong mother who's trying to make it, and the boys have a modeling, a very angry one, of a father who's absent, and this is now intergenerational, sometimes going 3-4 generations with things getting worse. So federal policy here needs a lot of scrutiny, and to the extent it follows the directions you're pointing towards, bear a lot of it to question. I won't put everything on top of that, but we are failing our poor massively in our policies there.
Well, but before I want to, because we can go back and forth in a wonderful debate, which may be the right decision, but I'm going to choose a different one, which is to open this to the floor. As is our tradition, I want to see if there are questions specifically from the press. I know that we have a number of folks from the press here. We'll take Cheryl's question first, and then any other press questions. And for everybody, if you would do me a favor, I think there should be someone with a mic here. Is there not? To have an opportunity, just introduce yourself very briefly and ask one brief question, so we have time for everyone's questions. All right, we'll start here with Cheryl, and then any other press questions, and then we'll open up more fully.
I'm Cheryl Wetstein with the Washington Times. I wanted to pull you back to the part about transferring sex education to marriage education. That's a really big event because there's so many stakeholders on sex education with products to sell and curricula to sell. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in sex education. Marriage education, on the other hand, is quite in its infancy, and I don't think contraception is going to be a whole big part of marriage education, a little bit of it, but not, it's a different stakeholders, different messages, everything. My question goes to the fact that the Obama administration has a Fatherhood, Families, and Marriage Innovation Fund. And there's a great deal of discussion about whether that's ever going to morph into any marriage education, because it's going to go more into child support, fathers, but that's your big vehicle for anything to do with marriage education. And I was hoping to get a reaction on what advice would you give the Obama administration, given the differences you see in the blue and red families.
Great. June?
Yeah, please. I'd like to emphasize, and I'd like to respond to that by picking up a little bit on what Pat was saying. We agree with his description of shortchanging the poor, and we believe that the efforts that Pat and others have championed are the single biggest obstacle to doing so. And when you describe exactly what you described about stakeholders in sex education, it's exactly the phenomenon we describe in the book. Real crisis about family values. What's the solution? Let's focus on the most controversial issues. Abstinence-only education. What happens with abstinence-only education? Rallies the base, gets churches involved in politics. And when I mean in politics, I don't mean in conducting the sex education, although they do. It's rallying the churches to be out there supporting the right candidates, which gets other people pretty riled up, which intensifies the support of the churches. What's the impact on family? Remember those slides we put up? At best, Pat talked a little bit about respect for diversity. At best, if you strengthen the commitment to abstinence, you might reach, there's a group out there, evangelicals who attend church once a week or more have higher rates of abstinence and delayed beginning of sexual activity. The other 75% of evangelicals begin sexual activity at younger ages than non-evangelicals. So what happens when you put all your eggs in the basket of abstinence-only education? Maybe help a few people at the margin. The people going to Harvard are abstinent without it, but at 15, not at 19. But the people who need help most are the group of poorer women who are more likely to enter their first sexual encounter with no information about anything except what they got from their high school sex education class, and are more likely than wealthier women to be in an abstinence-only program where they receive no information about birth control. I guarantee, one final point with Pat, education about contraception is about marriage. Married women spend more time on contraception than unmarried women. I guarantee that every woman in the audience knows that.
All right, I know, Pat. Here, let's just see how many more press questions we have. Any more other press questions that we have here? All right, so let's just take 2 press questions. Pat, hold your comment. You'll have an opportunity to respond. I'll start with you when we go. Take the final press questions, and we'll open it.
Mark Gruenberg with Press Associates. Pat and your colleague on the left here really didn't get into the economic problems that face families, and that was a big part of the book's presentation. Given the state of the economy and the forecasts that we're going to have continuing persistent high unemployment, talk about that impact on families.
So Pat and Eyal, do you want to talk about that? Pat, we'll start with Pat, and then Eyal, and then we'll open it up more fully.
Well, I think my response is going to be a truism. The poor will always have a harder time in recessions. The less educated will always have a harder time. And a good society will have lessened a lot of those things, and clearly we've failed. Our elites here have failed, guiding the economy, overextending it. What we've done with mortgage rates and over that whole mortgage crisis, which seems to be the biggest one underneath, is not the creation. This is a creation of both Congress and Wall Street, both. I see both complicit. So our leaders have not led the economy well, and of course our least prepared suffer most.
I would just say on the economy that I agree that those with least will be affected the most. The strains were there to begin with even before the recession, because America is the most unequal developed country in the world. We tolerate levels of inequality, wealth, income, and others that no other industrialized country tolerates. So a recession that then hits into that structure, which was fairly new actually, because between after World War II till about the early to mid 70s, inequality in America was actually going down. It's gone up over the last 30, 40 years, and I think that is going to add to the strains that are already there. The current economic situation. Just one more time on the question of, I'm not going to get into a debate about Sweden, but I'm sure I know less about it than Pat, but I don't know how. I understand people who say there is a fundamental need for a parent to raise and nurture a child and be at home. I don't think I disagree with that. But we do not live in a world, we do not live in a society where I don't know a single person in their 30s, a single couple married with children, in which only one of the people work. They both have work responsibilities that they're now juggling. And these are not, less educated, lower income people. These are people who simply have expenses and so they need to juggle 2 jobs, sometimes 3 between them. If we live in that world, what is the alternative to providing generous family leave and other policies that make it easier for parents to be responsible parents? The alternative is to leave them on their own, or to pretend that we live in a world that we don't live in? I think those questions have to be asked.
Good. The role of workplace flexibility. I'm going to invite all of our panelists to they're going to have comments from each other. They're going to generate great responses from each other, and when they respond to a question, then bring up the responses and weave them in a little bit, just as we have an opportunity, if you don't mind, just to hear from other folks at this point too. Raise your hands if you have a question here, so I get a little bit a sense here. All right, this is good. So let's do the following. I'm going to ask for doubling up a question. So we're going to have 2 questions, and then we're going to start having our panel have an opportunity to respond both to each other and then to the 2 questions. Okay, right here. Okay, Vicki, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Vicki Shabo, the Director of Work and Family Programs at the National Partnership for Women and Families. And just following up on what Eyal said and responding a little bit to what Mr. Fagan said, this isn't an issue about women wanting to go to work instead of staying home, or about families making a choice about one parent staying home versus going to work. This is an issue where families, and particularly those at the bottom of the income ladder, need to both be working, particularly in a recession that has disproportionately affected men, and where women are increasingly the primary breadwinners in their families. And so the question, as he said, is what is the role of government in that? And if the role of government in that is not to provide some sort of support, then we are failing our families, and we are contributing to marital distress, and we are contributing to children who are less happy. And so I guess my question to you is, what is the alternative there, given the reality that we live in?
Okay. All right. Now let's take a second one before Patty. So we have Vicky. I'm sorry to do it.
No, sure.
Is it Mitzi? Yes. We'll take your question and then Vicky's.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I happened to grow up in a family. I'm so old that only my father worked, but my mother wanted to work, and it wasn't easy to do then because she needed that stimulation. I'm struck by, and I'm a social anthropologist by training, I'm struck by the cultural value, which is all about making money now, and making money so we can buy things. And we end up buying a lot of stuff that doesn't have a lot of value, but there's this drive for making money, this drive in the corporate world for doing more with fewer people. I mean, I think the whole question of the structure of work and who gets employed and for how long is very much a base point in this, because if you don't take that into account, you're not going to get it. I mean, one final point I want to make was, in the 50s, I went to Europe with my parents, and we went to an Olivetti factory, and they had set up a program for the people who worked at Olivetti, and when your babies were 6 weeks old, they could come in, and the mothers could keep coming in. They would come in and take care of them. They would come in and have lunches, but you have to have a physical setup that allows for that.
Okay, very good. So we've got Vicky's question on the role of government, and Pat, we'll start with you to answer that piece. And then, Naomi, do you want to, because I know you had a thought from a question previously, just launch in from Mitzi's point a bit about some of our drivers and take it from there. Pat, do you want to?
Yeah. 3-4 things together very quickly. If the poor are not married, they are really stretched beyond. And by and large, our poor are not married. So you've got an apple or a chicken and egg issue here. If they are married, they do a huge amount better economically. Second thing, on childcare for the poor. Childcare, actually, the only study I know that has done this is Aguirre up at Catholic University, a real competent economist. Childcare for the poor actually takes away from the total family income. It doesn't add to it. The expense of childcare turns out to be, there's only one study I know, turns out to be greater than the income on average of the woman. So that's not necessarily a good route to go for the poor. Secondly, and coming back to your point, I totally agree with you on the value of money has changed things. Our poor today, given all that we give them and what they earn, in constant dollars, have a greater income than the middle class of the 40s. Just to put it in perspective, that's, you could do all sorts of things with that. But they have enough to have a humane life. What I think has gone wrong is a huge amount of the structures around and the way the culture pulls. And that's it, enough for the time being.
All right. Naomi, do you want to?
I was just going to say, I want to go back to a couple of things. Yeah. One is when we say change the subject from sex ed to marriage ed, we are still very much thinking that abstinence plus education is totally critical throughout. So we're not saying get rid of it. We're just saying focus on marriage ed. And when we talk about marriage ed, we're not saying push everybody into getting married, because when two poor people get married, they're still two poor people who are just now married. And their relationship isn't necessarily stable, and there are plenty of studies on what happens when you promote marriage among people who, imagine as June ended with Bristol and Levi, getting married right before Tripp is born. Who knows what would have been the fate of their relationship. So marriage isn't the answer. When we talk about marriage ed, we're talking about helping people who are in marriages remain there through various forms of marriage education. So that's one thing that sort of just responds to Pat's point about encouraging marriage promotion among poor people. It's encouraging job training, skills training, making sure that you can get support for your family life through public welfare while you are also pursuing your education so that you can pursue yourself into a better job. Now that then goes to Mitzi's point about, are we living in too much of a consumerist culture? That may be, that's its own issue. But what is happening, and one of the points that we make in the book, is that the blue family system is a response to the post-industrial economy. The red family system worked very well, and we actually tried we tried not to take positions for much of the book, although the red family system works very well when, with a high school education, one person can get a good job that will then support the family, and in that situation you can get married immediately out of high school, and non-marital childbearing is less important. In an economy that rewards higher education, more skills training, that's just not a solution. And so going back to the economy, part of the issue is the blue family system is a response to the post-industrial economy.
Very good.
Some of this is
Thank
about
you.
setting manufacturing jobs overseas, so we don't have those jobs here anymore.
All right, thanks. We'll take two more questions here, and then if we have a chance for follow-ups, we'll take Bob's question here, right, and then gentleman here, and then Catherine.
Yeah, Bob Lerman, American U and Urban Institute. Hi.
Oh, hi.
We met. Finally. Couple of empirical points and then a quick question. On the empirical side, research I've done shows that women who have premarital pregnancies, those that do marry, do much better in the long run, and so marriage is not irrelevant. Second, on the male side, it is true that male wages of the less educated have stagnated. What you do find is that marriage actually stimulates better labor market outcomes among men. So there is a dual causation that you have to take into account. My question is, given the gap that you're talking about between the blue and the red, and given the fact that the family structures of less educated and lower income people have deteriorated far more, why do you think the political position of the more liberal leaders has been so anti-marriage education? In the New York Times, for example, when the Bush administration put out its Healthy Marriage Initiative, had devastatingly negative arguments against it.
Very good, Bob. Thank you. We have a gentleman here. Let's do three of gentlemen, and then we'll have Catherine's question.
Charter freelance correspondent. Would the freedom without responsibility the very basic problem?
Very good. And then Catherine, let's take a third one there if we could.
Hi, I'm Catherine Myers with Family and Home Network, and we're a grassroots nonprofit who has been representing parents at home for 25 years. And I left home. I left 2 at-home mothers at my house this morning to come here. So I do know that there are at-home mothers and at-home fathers still in this country. I would like to know if you would please consider looking carefully at your assumptions about what the modern families are doing, or whether workplace policies for all is really the answer, because workplace policies leave out a lot of people. If you look at just family policies, family leave is not going to apply to people who are entrepreneurs. They're not going to apply to people who plan to cut back on work so that they can be home with their children. And when you ask parents themselves what they want, not people who aren't parents yet, but parents themselves, the vast majority of mothers say mothering is the most important thing they do, and they want more time with their families. So, and that comes from a study done by Enola Aird and the University of Minnesota, I think. So I would ask you please to look very carefully at the assumptions about what the solution should be for families and work, and to look at tax policy as well.
Great. These are great questions for a second. How many more questions do we have, just as I sort of think through for a second here? We have two more. All right, we'll start with these three here, and we've got Bob's looking at why the liberals are anti-marriage education. We've got a question on freedom and responsibility, and then Catherine's piece on the broader at-home and entrepreneurs affected by leave policies. Who wants to jump in here? June, do you want to start us off?
I think the issue is to recognize diversity. I mean, one of the ways in which our positions are a bit more conservative than some of our colleagues is that we agree having two adults committed to raising children and staying together, we think is a good thing. And what we want to focus in is...
although we disagree on this, I think, with Pat, on the sex of those two adults.
Well, and that's what I was going to get to. The fact that the couples who get married often do better doesn't mean insisting everyone gets married makes the rest better off. It doesn't work quite like that. And when we look at the poorest families, and you look at the wonderful work Amy Wax has done, pointing out that a big part of the problem is who are the men who are fathering the children for the poorest mothers, they're likely to be in jail, on drugs, violent, abusive, and those issues in the background are huge. Now, the question becomes, how do you change that? And that's where we feel very strongly that, for example, if you look at small-scale studies that look at the poorest women, if they have the children later, not so close together, and fewer of them, the children do better. And that next generation may be in a better position to have healthier relationships. So that's the issue. And the question, why are liberals opposed to healthy marriage initiatives? I'm not sure which healthy marriage initiatives. Marriage education itself is not so controversial. The notion that marriage must... Yeah, the notion that marriage, you can't have sex outside of marriage, same-sex couples can't marry, single parents, bring back the Scarlet Letter. Those are controversial.
All right. Who else wants to respond to our three questions? Any other? Take Pat or A.L., do you want to?
Yeah, Pat? I'd like to pull 3 or 4 things together. Dr. Lerman, good to recognize your scholarship in this area is fantastic.
Amen.
On your point, actually, the productivity of men controlling for all other factors, it was increases 27% when they marry, controlling for everything, even genetics and all the rest of it, follow up on that. So it has huge impact. Here's one of the things. Look, the big picture is, our culture, we are fracturing more and more. Our marriage rates are going down. Our divorce rates are going down, but our marriage rates are going down. Culturally, we're very much on the wrong track, and I do think it is connected to sexuality. Let me give you, here's a study we haven't made much of yet. I think we should. We looked at women 30 and above from the National Survey of Family Growth. Those who've only had one sexual partner, monogamous, 80% of them are in the same relationship, in that relationship. It hasn't broken. Those who've had one extra partner, and for most of those it would be before marriage, it drops from 80 down to 54. This is just pure correlation. I'm not controlling for a single thing. With 2 extra partners, it drops down to 44. Monogamy is key to the stability of marriage. Once we do not have social consensus on that. We don't have consensus here on that.
No.
But it has huge impacts on the stability of marriage, on income, on the poor, on the intergenerational effect of why you look at the number of sexual partners that our poor have by age 20. What do you think it is? Between 3 and 4. Their probabilities of marriage, should they ever get married, they're going to blow their divorce rates by 30s are going to be off the charts. They're going to be down in the 20-30%. Monogamy is key. We have lost our social consensus, and we reap it. We reap the consequences. You can't have your cake and eat it at the same time.
Right. As we approach 1:30, by the way, I'm going to thank C-SPAN for being here in case they need to log off. I had 2 final questions I saw here. The gentleman and I saw a second hand, a lady here, and we'll take those 2 as our final question. I'm sorry as we're up against time. If you'd ask just a very brief question, and then we're going to give a chance for each panelist to respond with a concluding comment, and then we're going to close for the day with apologies.
Hi, my name's Chuck Devine. The organization I'm probably most involved with from a political point of view is a professional aerospace group known as the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Do we see variations in attitudes towards families across various different professions. I suspect that we're seeing that in the older industrial-based fields like engineering and physics and things like that.
Thank you, Chuck. And then we'll conclude with the ladies' question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sarah Garrity with the European Institute. My question was just from a European point of view. I was wondering, I know it's an extreme example, but how exportable do you think a Swedish model, not exportable at all, I'd say, but I mean, some European countries have had no choice but to do something about their birth rates in particular by introducing some variation of a Swedish model. And I'm just wondering how you think that would fare in the US, or if there's any hope.
If we can win in soccer like you all do too as a result of your policies, we'll take it. All right, we're going to go down the line here. We're going to start with AL, and we'll go down and conclude with our authors here for final comments in response to our two questions here and to anything else that has been raised today.
I don't have that much to add other than just on the notion of monogamy and its importance. I think that one of the things that seems to be coming out in more and more research is the difference between what is professed and spoken and preached from the pulpit of a church or in a political campaign and what is actually practiced. And I think one of the most interesting things about the new research that's coming out is that in places where people speak very loudly and very, in a sense, dogmatically about both monogamy and marriage being only between a man and a woman, and sex happening only within marriage, we're seeing very high rates of divorce, of teenagers having children outside of marriage, and so forth. And at some point, we have to, I think, focus less on the rhetoric and more on what's actually happening and the actual practices that occur in the world we have. That would be my hope.
Thank you, Al. Pat, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I totally disagree. Look at Mapping America. The more people go to church, the less they commit adultery, the less they divorce, the less they have sex outside of marriage. The same holds for their kids. Now, I'm not preaching. I want total freedom here. No. This is the data talking. This is not Pat Fagan talking. This is federal government data. However, let me add I love where you're heading. I think the book is very hopeful with your concentration on marriage and the desire to restore that. Clearly, there's lots of work to be done, lots of disagreements to be worked out, and our kids are still going to be working on that. But you are definitely heading very much in the right direction, and I want to give you full support, and let's keep this going. This is great.
All right, thanks, Pat. All right, June?
Let me try to respond to a couple of the questions. On professions, in fact, there are quite a bit of differences in marriage rates of women in different professions. Lawyers, especially if they're working more than 45 hours a week, do badly. Women lawyers are less likely to be married. Doctors do really well. And on marriage, I mean, more likely to be married and more likely to have kids. I'm not quite sure why. On the Swedish model and birth rates, fascinating new data out in the last couple of weeks. Birth rates used to correspond inversely with socioeconomic status and education. Higher up the woman was, fewer children she had. But who's the group whose birth rates are increasing right now most dramatically? Women with graduate degrees. And why? The critical thing is whether or not the man helps out with the kids. So I had some of my law students over for dinner, and a woman in her mid-30s has a 7-month-old, and she says how much her husband wants the second kid, and having the second kid is dependent on how much he does. And that's what we're seeing across the board. Men are helping out more, but they're helping out the most at the top socioeconomic ladders. On the question of the rest of the population, what I have to say with Pat is, too much of what he said is, but listen to the wealth transfers. What he's saying he wants is to restructure society and have the better off pay less for the people at the bottom. We call that taking American and turning it into Yemen. Let people, give them religious values. Think about, I'm serious about the Islamic world. think about the high birth rates, the traditional role for women, and the lack of human capital. If we have a way of making this better, it's to think seriously about how to restore our investment in the human capital of the next generation. I live in Missouri, 6 blocks from the border with Kansas. Kansas has just raised taxes, is seeking to protect higher education, and has, if I go over the border, the best public schools in the country. At the elementary and secondary level, Missouri doesn't believe in investment in education to the same degree, though it's trying to catch up on higher education. That's where the future lies.
Thank you, June. Naomi, last word.
We're way over time, so all I want to do is say thank you for the generosity of the New America Foundation, to my fellow panelists, and to you for your questions and listening.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you all for coming. We'll look forward to the follow-up book, Swedish Families, Yemenis Families. But please join me in thanking Naomi and June and Pat and Eyal for the splendid thoughts today.